place you think you know, surrounded but you feel alone. You have a place to rest your head, but not a home. Feels like you lost yourself again. Sit in the silence of a friend. When you are fully known and loved, you have a home.
Hello and welcome to the Quiet Happiness Knits podcast, where I talk about all of the things that I am knitting and my love of yarn. My name is Emily. I'm coming to you from the woods behind my house up in Maine. So today I have a bunch of knitting to talk about. I have a couple of finished objects, some works in progress, and then I thought I would talk a little bit about a couple of the books that I've read recently, and then we'll wrap up with a poem. So, last time I uploaded a video, I was talking about packing knits to go on a trip. We went to Canada for my sister's wedding. We're Canadian citizens, so they allowed us across the border. But we had to quarantine for 2 weeks. I got a good amount of knitting done. I basically rotated between a couple of different projects. So yeah, but it was just really nice to take a couple of weeks away from work. I'm really grateful that I have a job where I have enough vacation time to do that. So it was nice to take a break from everything, to be in a different place. Even if it meant that we stayed in the same place, it was somewhere that was not my house. And so that was really nice. The wedding was beautiful. Obviously not the original plan, but it was still a really beautiful day. We were able to have the wedding down by some water, have the reception outside. It was just really nice. So, yeah. So that's pretty much what I've been doing. And I have been reading a lot. I read a lot while I was up in Canada, and then I've been doing a lot of reading since I've been home. It's nice to, I don't know, I hadn't been reading as much. Like, I've still been reading a good amount this year. I don't know, it just felt like the last couple of months it's really ramped up. The sunlight is like making a really weird shadow on my neck right now. I apologize. I am in the woods, which means the sun keeps moving behind different trees, so we'll see how this goes. I may move around, who knows. Okay, so first I will talk about some of the things I finished. I have 2 pairs of socks to talk about. Let me pull out my list. I wrote down the patterns just in case I forgot. So the first pair that I finished are the Windy Poplar socks by Amanda Purser, who is at birch.and.lily on Instagram. I picked these up as a part of Kim of Huga Canyon's literary knit-along that she was, I don't know if it's still going. I'm awful at keeping up with knit-alongs. They're inspiring, but I'm not good at like actually participating. But these socks, the name is based on, Amanda has a bunch of Anne of Green Gables inspired sock patterns. So the Windy Poplar socks come from the book Anne of Windy Poplars. And I love Anne of Green Gables so much. So of course, I had to knit a pair of Anne socks. It's hard to see the stitch pattern on the sock blockers. But it has a really nice, I don't know what this kind of cable is called, on the front. And then one of my favorite details that I really like is that on the sock, it's a heel flap and gusset, on the sock, of course on the sock. On the heel, it's a heel flap and gusset, but on either, the middle is a normal like slip stitch heel, but then on the sides, she has a really small cable, the same cable that runs along this side of the sock, also is on either side of the heel, which is just a really nice touch to jazz up the heel, which I always appreciate. And I finally bought myself a pair of sock blockers. I've been thinking about getting some sock blockers for a while, but I don't normally like block my socks. I just kind of wear them and then wash them. So then I'm like, it's fine. But these ones, they were really tight. Not necessarily tight, but because the yarn is a slightly heavier fingering weight yarn, and because it has a big lace panel down the front, it was just really hard to see the lace section on these socks. So I bought some sock blockers. I forget the name of the Etsy seller, but I will have a link down below, which is where you can find links to all of the things that I talk about. But it was nice to be able to block these and get to see what they were going to look like before I wore them, and these blockers are absolutely beautiful. I knew if I was going to get sock blockers, I wanted them to be something that I could just like hang up on the wall when I wasn't using them. So something that would be very, just like a piece of art in and of itself when not being used. And these are absolutely beautiful. I got the medium size. She has a few different sizes. But I'm usually a US size 8 shoe, somewhere around there. So this was the size that I went with, since I mostly knit socks for myself or for people who have feet similar to mine, I suppose. Oh, and I did forget to mention what yarn I used. I believe it is now a discontinued base, but the yarn is from On the Round, who is one of my favorite dyers, who happens to live in Maine, which is extra special. So I love her yarns, and this purple color is amazing. These are another pair of socks that I finished. These are the Toriel socks by Maven Crafted that I had talked a little bit about last time. I don't remember how far along I was in the first one, but I have since finished these socks. This was a really fun pattern. It has this twisted rib section that goes into a triangle on either side, and it's higher up in the back than it is in the front. And then it has that same pattern again on the top of the toe, which I love it when sock patterns have something on the top, like when the stitch pattern continues along the toe. I know it's not always easy to continue a pattern if it's like this, where it has one main stitch section that relies on a specific stitch count. It's hard to continue that when you're doing decreases on the toe of the sock. But for these, since the stitch pattern was already changing, like it was already based on decreases, so she incorporated that into the toe of the sock, which I think is just extra fun. This yarn is from a Legacy Fiber Arts sock set that I bought last fall, and it came with a purple mini skein, and I'll include a picture here of the other socks I made with this. The first pair was a pair of Night Walk socks by Lindsay of Lost and Fond, but then because I often have yarn left over when I'm done a pair of socks, like anywhere between 20 to 30 to 35 grams or so left of a 100 gram skein of fingering weight yarn. And then because that other sock used so much of the mini skein, I think I had about 50 grams left. And so I decided to knit these socks, which are a bit shorter. And I have like a very, very small amount of the yarn left. So I'm really happy that I was able to get 2 pairs of socks out of this sock set. So those are the socks I have finished. I have also finished a shawl. It's not blocked yet because I just finished it the other day. Oh, I still have yarn attached. There we go. So this is the Osmond shawl by Beatrice Perrin-Dolan. And I knit this out of some yarn that Beatrice had actually dyed. She did a little bit of botanical yarn dyeing earlier this year, the end of last year, I don't remember. But I had bought, I think she had sent the shawl pattern out as a free pattern to her newsletter subscribers. And so I got the pattern for free, and then I bought this yarn specifically. She was selling it specifically as a kit for this shawl. So it's, you cast on the end, and then you're doing increases until this middle point, and then you basically, you keep going. That's what you're doing. You continue doing the increases. So all of this is my bind off. It helps if it's not folded so you can see. So this is all the bind off edge. So basically you can just keep increasing and knitting until you run out of yarn, which is what I did. I have this much left of the lighter color, and this is what I have left of the darker color. I basically kept going until I had just enough yarn to do the bind off. So it has some fun eyelet sections in the contrasting colors. It is wonderfully light and soft. I believe it's like maybe a heavy lace weight, but it's a single ply yarn, so it's really soft, which means it's good for shawls, not so good for something that's going to take a lot more wear and tear. But it makes a delightfully cozy shawl. Because there's not really a hard point or anything, it's okay if my sides aren't completely the same size, it's not very super symmetrical, but it doesn't really matter because of the shape. So yeah, it just makes a nice cozy, I can pull it tighter if I'm outside and it's cold, and then I can kind of loosen it up a little bit so it's not as tight around my neck to wear it inside. So yeah, I am really happy with this. I'm excited to block it. My guess is that because it's a single ply yarn, a single ply 100% wool yarn, it will most likely bloom a bit while blocking, so it may grow a little. I did a relatively stretchy bind off, just to make sure if I blocked it and it grew that my bind off wasn't going to be constricting it. My go-to if I want a slightly looser bind off is to do, I don't know what the name of it is, but basically you knit 2 stitches and then you knit those 2 together. Instead of a traditional cast off where you knit 2 stitches and pull one over the other and off the needle, you knit 2 and then knit them together through the back loop so that you're just getting a little bit of extra yarn in between every stitch, and it just makes it nice and stretchy. And I've done this on ribbing, on garter stitch and stockinette stitch. It's just a really nice way to finish it off if you want it a little bit loose, but you don't want a sewn, a Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind off style of that's really loose, which is great if you're doing toe up socks or something where you need a lot of movement. But I find this knit 2 together bind off is really nice when you want a loose but not something that's going to fan out, if that makes sense. So those are all of my finished objects. The project that I spent the most time knitting on while we were in Canada was a sweater. So I've been working on the Boheme pullover by Annie Lupton. There's also a cropped version, which I was very tempted by because of the sleeves. She has these gorgeous bell sleeves. But I decided to go with the pullover. And I'm knitting this in, again, more yarn from On the Round. I forget, do I have the tag? This is it's in her signature sock base, which is now discontinued. She has a different merino wool nylon blend instead. And I think I like this base, but it's definitely not, this base that's now discontinued, it's definitely not the same as a typical merino nylon sock blend that you get from a lot of indie dyers. It's not as not as silky soft. It's got a little bit more grip to it, which I like, but I can see how if you didn't know what it felt like, you would buy it assuming it was going to feel a certain way. And I think her new sock base is more of a traditional merino nylon blend. Anyway, so this is in her garnet colorway, and I bought this from a Ravelry D-stash. So I knit both sleeves, the back, and a few inches on the, no, both sleeves, the front, and a few inches on the back while we were gone. So it is a saddle shoulder design. I started with the sleeves, just to get a feel for the stitch pattern. So I realized while knitting the second sleeve that I had messed up the lace pattern on this section of the first sleeve. So I'll probably rip this out and redo that at some point. So here are the two sleeves and the front. So you'll notice the front doesn't really have shoulder shaping because of the saddle shoulders. I've never knit this style of sweater before. So there's some short rows on the front to angle the shoulders a bit, and then this part is lower. You start your bind offs in the middle and work out. So I am super happy with this. I am so excited. And then this is the back. It was at the end of a row, and then I was filming footage to include in my poem reading section, so I'm now in the middle of a row. But the back is just the textured broken rib stitch pattern that's on either side of the lace panels. So I've been doing a lot of sweater math with this one because my gauge is a bit smaller than the pattern gauge. So I've been jotting down notes as I go along. So like I have a different number of lace repeats on the front, and what I didn't do this in the first sleeve, but what I did on the second sleeve was instead of binding off the top of this saddle shoulder section, I put on a stitch holder because I wasn't sure how much room I'll actually need because I'm knitting a larger size to get the measurements I want. So basically I'm knitting a couple sizes larger than I would have if my gauge would match the pattern. So I may need to rip a little bit of this back. I just left a really long tail in case I end up just needing to do a bind off. So, and I will, because I have to go back and fix the stitch pattern on this anyway, like if I need to adjust it, I'll do it then, after I'm done the front and the back and start putting it together. So this is what I spent the most time working on, and it became mindless knitting pretty much. I had the lace pattern after a few inches on the first sleeve. I had the lace pattern memorized. So, and I knit while I read anyway. And so I was able to just zoom along on the front of this sweater with minimal, like I didn't need to think about it a whole lot, which was nice. But it was it's a good combination of engaging enough so that if I wanted to just like sit down and only knit, it was engaging enough to keep my attention, but also mindless enough that I could do it while I was reading or watching something. And this is living. I don't always talk about what project bags I have, but these are my absolute favorite. This is from Matterroot, Maine, and I have a couple of these bigger bags, and then I have one of her sock bags, and they're just my favorite, and I love them so much. So that's what I spent the most time working on. And then 1 week, so we quarantined for 2 weeks, and then we stayed on for a couple of extra days to visit with people. So about after the first week, I was getting a little tired of doing the same thing all the time. So I decided it was time to pull out a new cast on. So I pulled out the yarn that I had packed to knit the Burst into Bloom, which is a wrap by Tina Say. And I have not worked on this since I've been home. I started another project I'll talk about next. So this is all while we are gone. And honestly, this is the knitting equivalent of like eating a delicious dessert. Like that's what I kept thinking. Like it just felt so decadent. Like the yarn is gorgeous and soft, and there's always something different happening with stitch patterns and color changes, and it is just amazing. So the yarn is from Wild Star Fibers, and I absolutely love it. I do have the colorway names, but I have the tags, but I don't remember which was which. But the yarn is absolutely beautiful. And so basically the wrap, you cast on in this bottom purple corner and do increases until you get to the correct number, and then you're knitting on the bias. So basically you're doing an increase on one side and a decrease on the other side, so that you end up with a rectangle, but you're knitting it at an angle. And so there's alternating sections, there's lace sections, which I decided to go, in the pattern Tina has a more variegated speckle yarn for these lace pieces, so that's what I decided to do. It's just a really simple eyelet pattern, and so I think once it's blocked you'll be able to see it a little bit more. So there's lace, there are garter stripes, and then just some stockinette, and then like a slip stitch with garter stitch ridges, which is so fun. And then you repeat those types of stitch patterns until the end. So I really want to work on this, but I also really need to finish this next work in progress, which is where I've spent most of my knitting time lately. Because I had a friend, one of my good friends from high school, reach out to me. She is a big Harry Potter fan, and so she asked if she could buy a Weasley sweater, if I could knit one for her. And I don't do a lot of sweater knitting for other people because it's a massive time and yarn investment, but I was willing to do this because she's my friend and because I know how much she loves Harry Potter. I ordered yarn for this while we were in Canada, and then I think it was waiting when we got back. It was here, so as soon as we get back, I started working on this. It's getting there. So I have knit the entire front and back in one sleeve, and then this morning I finished one sleeve and then immediately picked up stitches for the other one. So I've never knit a sweater with this exact construction before, where the front and the back are knit in pieces, and then you join them at the shoulder and then pick up stitches for the sleeve. And then when it's done, then you can seam it all up, and you can seam up like the side and the sleeve seam all at once. So this is a free pattern that I found. I'll include a link to the blog where I found it below. And it's also from a book called Charmed Knits, which is a whole book of Harry Potter patterns. And I believe this sweater has like more sizes or instructions for knitting it at a variety of gauges in the book, but this is a free pattern that the designer has on her blog. And so she includes some directions for designing your own letter. She includes a chart for the letters she uses, and she did an H, but includes links and ideas for making your own letter chart for it. So my friend's name starts with a K, obviously, so I did a K. So yeah, so it was like, I had thought about doing duplicate stitch for the letter, which some other patterns that I found online, or other people who knit this one, that's what they did, which makes sense because then you can figure out the placement after you're done knitting it. You don't have to figure that out while you're doing it, so it's easier to fix if it's not quite right. But I also haven't done enough duplicate stitch, especially not since this is a worsted weight yarn, and so I just felt like trying to do a worsted weight duplicate stitch, it would just end up with like gaps, and like it would just, I didn't want to try it because I just didn't see it looking very nice. So I did Intarsia, which I haven't done a whole lot of, but I think it turned out pretty well, if I do say so myself. I may go back and do a little bit of, I left long tails on the inside, so I may go back and do a little bit of just like stitching in the floats or something to make sure that it stays in place, because it took a little bit of like tugging at the yarn from different directions to get the K to look a little bit nicer. So I may go through and kind of like fasten up some of the floats. So yes, I'm really excited. So I'm almost done. It knits up really fast because it's a worsted weight and it's just stockinette stitch, and there's no waist shaping or anything. My friend does have pretty long arms. She's pretty tall, so I have to make sure. I had her measure a sweater. She doesn't live close to me anymore, so I had her measure a sweater and give me the dimensions across the chest, and then the length from the neckline and the sleeve length. So I may have overestimated on the sleeves a little bit, but it's a ribbed cuff, so she can always, I'll just like tuck the ends way up so she can always just like roll up the cuff. Yes, I'm a little bit worried the neck hole won't be big enough, but if all else fails, I can unpick a little bit of the shoulder seams, because it wasn't like I thought about doing a 3 needle bind off, but then I decided not to, so I just did mattress stitch. So if all else fails, I can just unpick the sleeve seams a little bit to widen the neck hole. So yes, this is my Weasley sweater. Oh, I'm knitting this out of Knit Picks Brava Worsted, which is a 100% acrylic base, and they didn't have any good yellows or like gold colors or anything in that base that were in stock, so I went with their Swish Worsted, which is a superwash merino nylon blend, which I had considered getting for the whole sweater, but the Brava was just a lower price point than this one. So yeah, I am pretty happy with how that's working up, and so yeah, I've really just been trying to focus on this while I still am excited about it and am motivated, since if it were for me, it would be okay if it sat in a bag in a corner for a couple of months while I worked on other things, but it's not for me. So I actually want to make sure it gets done. And then once I'm done that, I know a couple of people who are having babies this fall, so after I'm done that one, I need to whip up a couple of baby sweaters. I don't need to, I want to, but that's next on my knitting list. Some of my other works in progress may languish a little bit, but I've got three people I know who are having babies, so I'll be doing some stash diving and coming up with some baby sweaters. So I'll talk more about those once I get them done. So that is pretty much all I have been doing as far as knitting goes. But like I mentioned earlier, I have been doing a lot of reading recently, so I thought I would talk about 2 books that I have recently finished. So the first book is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. This is a nonfiction book about a real woman. Obviously, it's nonfiction. It's about a real person named Henrietta Lacks, who I was trying to like summarize the back, because I'll just read the back or part of it. It says, her name was Henrietta Lacks, but scientists know her as Gila. She was a poor black tobacco farmer whose cells, taken without her knowledge in 1951, became one of the most important tools in medicine, vital for developing the polio vaccine, cloning, gene mapping, and more. And these cells have been developed and sold all across the world. There are billions and billions of them now, but her family didn't know anything about it until after Henrietta ended up She had cancer and she died. And then her family didn't know anything about the cells for a really long time. And so it took the author, Rebecca Skloot, I believe she researched and for a decade to find out all the information and pull together this book, because there wasn't really anything publicized about the actual woman whose cells were being used all over the world by so many scientists. So this is about, as the tagline says, it's a story of the collision between ethics, race, and medicine. And a lot of it focuses on her daughter, who was really wanting to understand what the cells were being used for and what was happening and what had happened to her mother. And so this is definitely, I sometimes struggle to get through nonfiction. I just need to read it slower to process it. It doesn't, and I'm not normally like, oh, I can't wait to pick up this nonfiction book. But this is one that I couldn't wait to finish. I wanted to know what had happened and what they were finding out and what was happening, what had happened to Henrietta, and then what was continuing to happen in her family. So definitely fascinating and insightful and thought-provoking book. So I really, really enjoyed this one. And speaking of books that make me really want to read them, The Lions of Fifth Avenue by Fiona Davis. I read this in a day. I started it on a Friday. I read a few chapters before I started working in the morning, and I was working from home, so I didn't have a commute time. So I had a few extra minutes of reading time. And then I was done reading early because it was a Friday, or I was done working a little bit earlier since it was a Friday, and I stayed up until like 10:30 or 11 to finish it. And I'm normally like a lights out by 10 o'clock even on the weekends person, just because I need my sleep. But I stayed up to read this one. It was so good. It was so good. Okay, so besides telling you that it was just so good, it's basically there's parallel stories going on. One of them, I forget the timing, 1913 is when the first story starts, and then 1993 is when the second story is taking place. So the two main characters in 1913, the main character is a woman named Laura Lyons. Her husband is the superintendent of the New York Public Library, and at that time, the superintendent had an apartment inside the library. So this is when the library was new. So she and her husband and her two children lived inside the library, which sounds like so much fun. Also stressful, but so much fun. And so it's about her life and choices that she made and struggles that she faced and love and loss and tragedy and heartbreak and ultimately hope. But there's a mystery that's happening where books are going missing from the library. Come 1993, her granddaughter is a curator at the New York Public Library. And there's also a mystery happening in 1993 that may or may not be connected to the 1913 mystery. And so I kept reading and reading and reading until I was done. Both because I wanted to find out what was happening in these two parallel mysteries that seemed to be connected, but it wasn't obvious how they were connected. So I kept reading both because of the mysteries and because I just really loved the characters and wanted to find out what happened to them and what choices they were making and what was happening to the people they loved. And it was so good. This is a new release this summer. So I know hold lists on it may be longer. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks has been out for several years, so if you're interested, I'm sure it'd be a lot easier to get a copy of this one. I get this out from my library. If it hadn't arrived within a few weeks, I may have just bought it anyway. But it's so good. Highly recommend. Highly recommend. I am glad that my library is open and doing, they're open up again. They were open up to do curbside pickup for a while, but now their interlibrary loan system is open up again, and I use that a lot. I tend to use that more than I do just browsing in the library, just because of the hours. I find it easier to slide through, like on my way home from work, and pick up books that I've already ordered, I don't always have a lot of time to just wander around. So I am very happy that they're open for interlibrary loan again, because it means that I can buy less books. I have bought a lot of books. Almost all of the books I've purchased have come from a bookstore close to where I live. So I feel good about all my book buying, but I really don't need to buy more books. I did buy a new bookshelf recently, which I think I took some video footage, so I'll include some videos somewhere. But I really, but the thing is, I love to buy books, but I also am totally fine getting rid of books. Because I think with books, I can generally find them. Like, if I really wanted to buy it again, I could find it used somewhere, or if I wanted to read it again, I could order it from the library or find it on an ebook service. So I hold my book collection with open hands. There are some books that I definitely want to keep and won't get rid of, and there's some that I keep rereading, and some that I buy and want to read. But I'm fine getting rid of books. Yarn, on the other hand, I have a harder time getting rid of. But anyway, so yes. So those are a couple of books that I have really enjoyed reading recently. One book that I bought from my local bookstore lately was a book of poetry. I bought a few after I had asked on Instagram for some poet/poetry collection recommendations, and then a friend recommended Morgan Harper Nichols. And I've seen a lot of her stuff shared online. She's active on social media and posting snippets of poetry on just on some really beautiful backgrounds. So a lot of people share those. But I had never just read her poetry. So this is her latest collection. I think it's fairly new. Yeah, it was new this year. I could only find it in hardcover, which is totally okay because look at how beautiful it is. And it's even that perfect hardcover where the cover, where the letters are slightly raised, which I just absolutely love. I don't know what it's called, and I don't know why I love it, but I love it a lot. So this is so the collection is called All Along You Were Blooming by Morgan Harper Nichols. So this week, yesterday, I was okay, I'll pull this out and I'll read a few of her poems before I go to bed. I pulled it out, so I read the first poem and just stopped. I didn't need to read anymore. That one left me with enough that I wanted to think about and ponder over. So I just I'm very excited to read the rest, and also want to move through them slowly because they're so beautiful. So in her poems, they don't have titles. So this one does not have a title. So I would like to read to you the first poem in Morgan Harper Nichols' collection called All Along You Were Blooming. Hold tight to hope amidst all unanswered questions. For even in uncertainty, there is strength to be found, and grace will still abound in what you do not understand. Under blue skies, on cracked rocks, in dry heat, in desert land, grace is the hand that is never out of reach, reminding you, you are not weak because you are lonely. And even if you have heard the word grace over and over again, and you think you already know what it means, there is grace for that too. Humbly reminding you of its endlessness, and how much you need it when you are lost in the wilderness. So do not be disheartened when the landscape is working against you, and do not think that you have failed when you are not sure you'll make it through. For this glorious, unmerited favor called grace will meet you where you are, giving you peace amidst your restlessness and safety from alarm. Love it so much. I think the line where I get halfway through and just had to stop and put it down, the line at the end of the second stanza that says, grace is the hand that is never out of reach, reminding you, you are not weak because you are lonely. Especially with what we're going through right now, and how we're separated and we're out of our normal spheres, and it's really easy to feel lonely because you're not able to be around people like normally we are. You are not weak because you are lonely. Like, I didn't need to read any more poems. Like, that line itself was enough. So thank you, Morgan Harper Nichols, and to my friend who recommended her to me, that pushed me to finally buy this book. So that is all I have to talk about today. Let me make sure. Yes. So I would love to know what you've been making recently, or if you've read any good books lately. I am always up for a book recommendation. Actually, after I talked about books, or maybe just the kind of books I wanted to read, I don't remember what it was. On my last video, I had someone reach out to me on Instagram and recommend a book called The Muse by Jessie Burton, which I'd also devoured while we were in Canada and absolutely loved. So I am always up for a good book recommendation. I'm always up for giving good book recommendations as well. I have had friends who will send me a message and be like, oh, like, I'm looking for a book to read. And I'm like, just massive Facebook messages of book recommendations for different moods and different genres. But if you ask me for a book recommendation, I will pretty much always recommend The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Absolutely love that book. I love anything she writes is beautiful. I love the Anne series. I love the Emily of New Moon series. But The Blue Castle is a standalone book, and it's shorter than some of her other books. And I just love it so much. So I always recommend The Blue Castle to everyone. And the Lunar Chronicles series, which are fairy tale retellings set in the future. It's basically their sci-fi, fantasy, fairy tale retellings, and they are perfection, and I love them. So blanket recommendations for everyone. If you want more specific ones, I love to give and receive book recommendations. So I'd love to know if you've been reading anything lately, what you've been making. So until I see you next time, I hope that you are doing as well as you can, and that you're finding some time to create beauty in your life in whatever form that looks like. Bye.
You're in a place you think you know, surrounded but you feel alone. You have a place to rest